La dichiarazione di guerra è già stata consegnata.
As the twilight of Mussolini's reign descended upon Italy, two women stood at the heart of his tumultuous end. Clara Petacci, the youthful mistress whose tragic devotion became the stuff of legend, and Rachele Mussolini, the steadfast wife grappling with her husband's catastrophic downfall. Their stories, woven through the final days of fascist Italy, reveal a tale of love, loyalty, and the bitter ironies that marked the collapse of an era. From secret rendezvous to desperate flights, and from dramatic captures to ultimate sacrifices, this is the riveting saga of the women who stood by Mussolini, each in her own compelling way. "I will not give women the right to vote. A woman must obey," declared Mussolini in 1921, making it clear that he was aiming for the most misogynistic dictator award. 8 years later, he rallied Italian women with a new slogan: "Do without, bear children." Rachele Mussolini, his wife, enthusiastically embraced these directives, treating the Duce's word as gospel without so much as a raised eyebrow. Born in an era when Italian women transitioned seamlessly from being daddy's little girl to wifey dearest without any pesky legal rights, Rachele stuck to her God-given role as a wife and mother like glue on a kindergartner's art project. As the mastermind behind Italian fascism, Mussolini enshrined the traditional image of women in his power structure, and Rachele was all for it. She seemed blissfully unaware that he promoted the cult of motherhood like it was the latest fashion trend, barred women from political office as if they were bouncers at an exclusive club, and ensured they were legally subordinate to men. Even if she had noticed, it's safe to say criticism wasn't in her repertoire. Her interest in her husband's political escapades was limited to how often she was included in the credits. Her job description was strictly household manager and child rearer. She didn't expect more, nor was she granted more. Her mother and grandmother had lived by the same script, and so did she, without a second thought. Donna Mussolini entered the world as Rachele Guidi on April 11, 1890, in Predappio, a tiny town in Romagna, central Italy. Her parents, Agostino and Anna Guidi, were impoverished tenant farmers, scraping by on land owned by the affluent Zoli family. Their rent was paid in back-breaking labor and a significant chunk of their harvest. Growing up in such dire circumstances, it was a given that all 7 children, 2 sons and 5 daughters, would pitch in to make ends meet. Rachele was the youngest in the hard-luck Guidi clan. Every morning, the blonde-braided toddler was feeding the poultry and guiding the pigs to pasture with all the seriousness of a mini-farm manager. A compliant child, Rachele performed her chores without so much as a whimper of protest. Only once, at the grand old age of 6, did she voice a desire. She wanted to go to school. This was quite the curveball, in an era when education was as optional as reading the terms and conditions online, especially for farm kids destined for a lifetime of illiteracy. Her father was having none of it. He was convinced that school would rot Rachele's brain with useless facts, wasting precious time she could spend shoveling pig poop. But Mama Guidi was a surprising ally, and eventually the womenfolk won, and Rachele was off to elementary school in Predappio. But the academic honeymoon was short-lived. After just 1 year, her older sister Giovanna got married and took a permanent leave of absence from the family workforce. This was enough for their landlord to kick the Guidis off the farm. The family relocated to Dovia, another Predappio neighborhood. Here, Rachele resumed her schooling under the stern gaze of Rosa Maltoni Mussolini, who taught in the Palazzo Varano, the future town hall. Rosa's husband Alessandro, a blacksmith and zealous socialist, hammered out political rants as vigorously as he did horseshoes. Their eldest son, Benito, occasionally assisted with the teaching, projecting an aura of seriousness and command. His serious face and energetic voice made a great impression on me, Donna Rachele later mused in her memoir. He was 10 years older than me and demanded utmost discipline and order. I was mesmerized by his dark, glowing eyes. Tragedy struck when Rachele was not yet 8. Her father died, and her schooling was permanently interrupted. Agostino's death spelled disaster for the family, robbing them of their primary breadwinner. The family relocated to Forlì, a bustling town where they hoped to strike gold, or at least bronze, in the job market. The plan worked, sort of. Anna and the eldest daughter, Agostina, landed jobs quickly, while Rachele secured a gig with a greengrocer. In 1905, however, the winds of change blew through Anna Guidi's life. Rachele's former teacher, Signora Mussolini, had passed away. Her widower, Alessandro Mussolini, packed up and moved to Forlì, ditched the smithy and opened a cafe. Anna caught wind of this and asked Alessandro for work. He took her on as a housekeeper but quickly upgraded her to mistress. Despite this dubious arrangement, it did provide Anna a chance to reconnect with Rachele. Ashamed of her scandalous living situation, she delayed contacting her daughter, leaving Rachele in the dark for 3 years. During this time, Rachele worked for the influential landowner Chiodini, scrubbing floors and overhearing snippets of gossip. One day she eavesdropped on Chiodini railing about a young agitator who had stirred up the farm workers, leading a protest for rights. Audacious indeed. Chiodini proudly announced that the rabble-rouser, Benito Mussolini, was safely behind bars. Rachele kept scrubbing but felt a spark of satisfaction. Someone was finally challenging the status quo, and it was none other than the boy she had once admired. In autumn 1908, fate reunited Rachele and Benito. Rachele later recounted the encounter. "I had just left Mass with Chiodini's daughter. We lingered in the San Mercuriale church square, basking in the sun. Suddenly I heard my name. I turned to see those fiery eyes. For a moment nothing else existed, and my heart raced. It was Benito Mussolini." From him, Rachele learned of her mother's whereabouts. She quickly escorted Chiodini's daughter home, sought permission to visit her mother, and was surprisingly granted the afternoon off. The joy of the reunion must have eclipsed Anna's guilty conscience, because Rachele was warmly welcomed and moved in shortly thereafter. Rachele also caught up on Benito's tumultuous journey. He had passed his teaching exams, briefly taught in Gualtieri Emilia, and then fled to Switzerland in 1902 to dodge military service. There he mingled with Italian and Russian socialists, honing his political acumen. He juggled various jobs: laborer, teacher, salesman, journalist, and when work dried up he resorted to begging, was arrested for vagrancy and deported. Back in Italy, he grudgingly completed his military service, taught again, spent time in France, and returned to Romagna, only to be jailed after a protest. Post-release, unable to find work, he planned to join the newspaper Il Popolo in Trento as a journalist, ready to stir the pot even more. A week after Rachele found refuge in the Mussolini family home, Benito departed, leaving her with a memory that felt like a live wire. In her memoirs, Rachele recounted the farewell. "He took me aside, looked at me with his sparkling eyes, and to my surprise said, 'When I come back, you will be my wife. You must wait for me.' It came like a lightning bolt." True to form, Mussolini was back in Forlì within the year, founding the socialist weekly Class Struggle with his comrades. Meanwhile, Rachele received a marriage proposal from Olivieri, a young man from Ravenna, but Rachele's heart belonged to Benito, who had conveniently forgotten to mention marriage again. Not one to miss a dramatic opportunity, Rachele ensured Benito heard about the proposal. He sprang into action, sending a letter to Olivieri demanding he withdraw his offer. Rachele later reflected in her memoirs, "What impressed me was his fearless character, which never stopped when facing an obstacle until it was overcome. But most of all, I loved his kindness, which was hidden behind an apparent hard pride." Shortly afterward, Benito summoned a family council, his father, Rachele, and her mother. He announced he had rented 2 rooms and intended to take Rachele with him. When his father objected, Benito brandished a revolver and declared, "I have 6 bullets. One is for her," pointing at Rachele. "The others are for me." Anna Guidi was the first to give in. Rachele moved in with Benito, although her dreams of a church wedding evaporated. Benito, indifferent to even a civil ceremony, found marriage unnecessary. The 17-year-old had to settle for his word that they would eventually formalize their union. Their modest abode comprised 2 small rooms, furnished with just 4 sheets, 4 plates, and 6 sets of cutlery. Meals were equally sparse, a minestrone with scant meat at noon and cabbage or turnips for dinner, barely enough to stave off hunger. While Rachele managed her tiny household, the political tumult in Forlì's streets escalated. Benito often returned home battered from nightly brawls between socialists like himself and Republicans and conservatives. On September 1st, 1910, Rachele gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Edda. The birth went smoothly, and Mussolini proudly carried a wooden cradle home on his shoulders. However, their first major argument arose when Mussolini vehemently opposed baptizing their daughter. Rachele eventually relented, exemplifying the passive obedience typical of Romagna women, for whom the man's will was law. Initially, Mussolini condemned World War I as an imperialist conflict, but soon changed his tune, believing the war could spark a revolution. This shift led him to advocate for Italy's entry into the war, resulting in his expulsion from the Italian Socialist Party, which staunchly maintained neutrality. Without the support of the party, Mussolini had no choice but to bid Forlì arrivederci. The family relocated to Milan, where they dragged along Rachele's mother after Benito's father had kicked the bucket. To finance the move, they had to sell off most of their furniture, clinging only to the essentials: the bed, Edda's cradle, and kitchen utensils. Luckily, their pricey new apartment came pre-furnished, making the loss bearable. In Milan, Mussolini birthed his own newspaper, The People of Italy, with a little help from Italian industry. Right below the masthead, he emblazoned, "Whoever has iron has bread." One can only assume he wasn't talking about a balanced diet. On May 23, 1915, Italy declared war on Austria-Hungary, and by August 28, 1916, they added Germany to their list of frenemies. Mussolini, always the drama queen, volunteered for the front lines. Rachele rarely heard from him, but she kept up with his war stories via his articles in his newspaper. Eventually, news arrived that Benito had contracted typhus. Rachele hitched a ride in a cattle wagon to the field hospital near Treviglio to check on him. By the time she arrived, he was already out of danger and on the mend. During this visit, he granted one of Rachele's secret wishes. They got married at the civil registry. The modest ceremony, attended by only 2 comrades acting as witnesses, was far from the grand affair Rachele had envisioned. Despite missing the family presence and the church blessing, she was thrilled to finally be Signora Mussolini. Benito soon returned to the front, and Rachele headed back to Milan. On September 27, 1916, she proudly announced the birth of their second child, Vittorio. The post-war years in Italy were a festival of chaos, featuring a severe economic crisis, strikes, uprisings, and factory occupations. The government's grip was weaker than overcooked pasta. Mussolini, who returned from the war with a fresh anti-everything stance, anti-socialist, anti-bourgeois, anti-capitalist, decided Italy needed a strongman to start with a clean slate. He found a kindred spirit in Italian writer Gabriele D'Annunzio, and they voiced their views loud and clear in his newspaper. In 1919 in Milan, Mussolini led a motley crew of about 200 disgruntled socialists, trade unionists, republicans, anarchists, and ex-soldiers, forming the Fascio di Combattimento. The term fascio hails from the Latin fasces, bundles of rods symbolizing power in ancient Rome. These bundles, bound with a bright red leather strap, became the metaphorical glue for the fascists. Their squadristi sported black shirts, borrowing the anarchist style, and waved the death's head banners of the Arditi, an Italian army commando unit. This ragtag band of disillusioned folks morphed into a movement of revolutionary action, intent on toppling the bourgeois system. On April 22, 1918, Rachele gave birth to their third child, son Bruno. He arrived a few days early, much to the chagrin of Benito, who had planned to be present. He rushed home fuming and reproached Rachele. "Couldn't you have warned me?" Realizing the absurdity of his expectation, he laughed and apologized. The parliamentary elections of November 1919 were a flop for the new fascist party. When the results came in, Mussolini warned Rachele about the potential backlash from the political left. "Don't get upset if a crowd gathers in front of our house. Think of the children. If I don't come home, I'm either dead or in prison." Rachele, taking no chances, hid her 3 children in the storeroom. That evening, socialists paraded past their house with torches and 3 coffins for Mussolini, Marinetti, and D'Annunzio. The electoral defeat did not faze Mussolini. He regrouped the fascist troops, rebranding his Fascio di Combattimento into the Partito Nazionale Fascista, National Fascist Party. The new party became a magnet for the political right and snowballed into a mass movement in the 1920s. In the 1921 parliamentary elections, the fascists snagged 35 seats, with Benito Mussolini becoming a household name. His big break came in 1922 when a general strike was declared. Mussolini, never one to miss a dramatic opportunity, declared, "Either the government power is handed over to us, or we seize it through a march on Rome." Spoiler alert, this was not a bluff. While his black-shirted fascists did indeed march, Mussolini lounged around waiting for a call from the king. The government wanted to declare a state of emergency, but King Victor Emmanuel III decided a dramatic plot twist was in order and refused to sign the decree. Instead, he handed Mussolini the reins to form a government. On October 31, 1922, Mussolini was appointed prime minister. With the conservative elites, business tycoons, military brass and church bigwigs rallying behind him, he quickly set up a coalition government with conservative bourgeois parties. Mussolini swiftly monopolized power, slotting fascists into all key government positions, despite their minority status. He adopted the grandiose title Duce, which means leader in Italian, and soon enough, everyone from the foreign press to his own grandchildren were calling him that. For Rachele, life remained business as usual. Firm in her traditional view of a woman's role, she steered clear of her husband's political escapades and devoted herself to her family, especially her 3 children. Mussolini, ever the image-conscious leader, ensured there was no whiff of nepotism. So Rachele stayed in their modest Milan apartment while he toiled away in Rome, making cameo appearances at home. Despite her low profile, Rachele was besieged by journalists eager to scoop an interview with the Prime Minister's wife, only to find her alone and knee-deep in household chores. Rachele, brushing off the political circus, insisted she was just Mussolini's wife and had no interest in politics, then promptly sent the journalists packing. This aloofness painted her as disinterested in Mussolini's political life. In reality, Rachele was an active participant, albeit silently, offering unwavering support and keeping secrets like a vault. Mussolini trusted her implicitly, valuing her memory for events, dates and names, often consulting her for details. In January 1925, Mussolini embarked on building a totalitarian one-party dictatorship. He threw political opponents into prison and methodically dismantled all non-fascist parties and organizations. With a compliant parliament filled with fascists, he pushed through the necessary laws to cement his and the party's power. In late 1925, Mussolini threw Rachele a curveball. He wanted to get married in a church. With his political ties to the Vatican making this step unavoidable, Rachele, who had long since buried her own dream of a church wedding, was overjoyed. Our deep bond, the lasting and mutual love we have offered each other in our tumultuous life, and especially our children, mean more to us both than the usual conventional conditions, but I am still happy to agree to the blessing of our union before God, she said. The ceremony was a low-key affair on December 29, 1925 in Milan. A year later, Rachele was pregnant again. Mussolini, who had no doubts that it would be a boy, decreed that their 3rd son be born in Romagna, following the family tradition. The birthplace was a small farm in Carpena, near Rachele's hometown of Predappio. Mussolini had gifted her the farm, and an ecstatic Rachele left Milan without hesitation. Shortly before the birth, Rachele called her husband in Rome. Benito hopped into his small plane. Yes, he had a pilot's license, and 5 hours later, he landed in Carpena. He came loaded with baby supplies and a stack of telegrams congratulating him on the birth of a healthy boy. Mussolini was so confident about the outcome that he had already broadcast the happy news. On September 26, 1927, his son Romano was born. The whole country celebrated, and Mussolini seized the moment to urge Italian women to follow Rachele's example. Bear children for the fatherland. It's your sacred duty. Nothing like a little nationalistic guilt trip to boost the birth rate. Once Rachele, now a mother of 4, recovered from childbirth, she threw herself into managing her new property. She raised chickens and other small livestock and spent hours planning new pastures. In the countryside, she felt truly content, staying connected to the land. She learned about Mussolini's national and international exploits from his reports and the newspapers, but did not partake in his life in Rome. She viewed his career as a spectator. Should Mussolini ever tumble from his lofty perch, she believed that her house and farm in Romagna would ensure her survival. The land was a more reliable bet than the fickle world of politics. 2 years later, Donna Rachele was pregnant again. Mussolini, ever the control freak, declared it had to be a girl. On September 3, 1929, Rachele delivered a daughter named Anna Maria after her late mother. The Duce was pleased and began house hunting in Rome, declaring, "I want to enjoy my children in my quiet hours." Rachele, obedient as ever, prepared to move. Though leaving Capena was tough, she relocated to Rome on November 15th. The Villa Torlonia became the Mussolini family's new residence. This brightly colored neoclassical mansion, surrounded by a sprawling park enclosed by a high wall, was straight out of an Italian fairy tale. Statues, obelisks, greenhouses, a theater, and even a small lake dotted the property. Despite the opulence, Rachele refused to play the role of Italy's First Lady. She sought no special privileges, kept the household frugal, and warned against pompous guests and bad friends. She made her disdain for fascist sycophants clear, even to her future son-in-law, Count Ciano. Recounting the fairy tale wedding of her eldest daughter Edda on April 24, 1930, Rachele wrote in her diary, "Villa Torlonia is a sea of white flowers. It looks like a greenhouse. The staff tells me they no longer know where to put the flowers, and I send 4 truckloads to the church and the monument for the fallen at the Verano Cemetery. The reception was prepared by others, but eventually I had to oversee everything myself. A select group of guests, among whom I recognized many famous faces, was invited, and I tried to look at them without showing curiosity. During the ceremony, however, I only saw my daughter's pale face and prayed, 'Lord, make her happy.'" Benito was also moved. "I noticed the deep vertical wrinkle on his forehead. More than once, he sought my gaze, and I understood him." The gossip that Il Duce was cheating on his wife was as persistent as the Roman heat. Mussolini had a habit of taking women whenever he wanted. From village girls in his earlier days to left-wing or right-wing comrades and journalists later on, he was never picky. He'd quickly handle his business in private quarters, or even on a stone bench under his office window at the Roman Piazza Venezia. This behavior earned Rachele the unfortunate title of the most cheated-on wife in Italy. Sometimes she knew about his brief affairs, sometimes she just had a hunch, but she always turned a blind eye. It stung, but she could live with it because Benito was her husband, whom she and the children loved. She was sure he would never leave his family for another woman. However, in the spring of 1932, Mussolini met a young woman whose existence Rachele could no longer ignore. Clara Petacci was a polarizing figure. Some saw her as an opportunist, looking to benefit her family from her relationship with Mussolini, while others viewed her as the devoted lover who stood by El Duce until the bitter end. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. The Petacci family belonged to the papal nobility, but had renounced their noble rights in the 19th century when Clara's grandfather, Eduardo Petacci, entered the service of the Ottoman government in Constantinople. He later returned to Rome with 4 sons and 4 daughters. The eldest son, Francesco Saverio, studied medicine in Milan and opened a practice in Rome. Moving in Vatican circles, he married a relative of Pope Pius XI and eventually became the Pope's personal physician. Francesco Saverio and his wife Giuseppina Persichetti had 3 children, the third being a girl born in 1912 and baptized Clara, though she was usually called Claretta. She was a dark-eyed brunette, a beauty and a romantic dreamer who loved painting watercolors and writing poetry, but her greatest passion was her love for Il Duce. Even as a little girl, Claretta adored him. While her friends plastered their walls with pictures of movie stars, hers were covered with photos of Mussolini. Every year, she sent him a poem at Easter and Christmas. Whenever a speech by Il Duce was announced, she would arrive hours early to stand as close to him as possible. In 1932, Claretta got engaged to an Air Force Lieutenant, Riccardo Federici, at her parents' urging. But before the wedding could take place, fate intervened. In April 1932, Professor Petacci had recently bought a convertible and decided to take his family on a trip to Ostia. It was a warm day, and though the sea was still cool, the young folks went swimming. After lunch, the Petacci family drove on to Castelfusano to stroll in the forest. Occasionally, cars overtook them, including Mussolini's open Alfa Romeo. Clara recognized the car, took off her straw hat and waved it wildly. "Duce, Duce," she called excitedly. The Alfa had already passed, but around the next bend, it was parked by the side of the road. The Petacci family stopped behind it and got out, thrilled by the unexpected chance to meet the man loved and revered by all of Italy. It was a brief conversation, during which Mussolini seemed most interested in the name of the young girl who had waved to him so fervently. Then they continued their drive. 3 days later, Il Duce called and asked to speak to Claretta. He invited her to his office in the Palazzo Venezia the next afternoon. With a pounding heart, Claretta accepted the invitation and became the lover of the most powerful man in Italy without hesitation. The fact that she was committing adultery and that there was no hope of ever legitimizing the relationship, Mussolini left no doubt about this, was indeed a problem for the devout Catholic woman, but she quickly found a justification. If the love was great enough, God would understand and forgive her, she believed. She saw herself as a selflessly loving woman, always ready to give everything for her beloved man, even her life if necessary. For the next 2 years, the 19-year-old Clara and the almost 50-year-old Mussolini met almost daily. Signorina Petacci regularly left her father's house after lunch and drove to the palazzo, where she often waited for hours in a small private room next to Mussolini's office until the great government leader could spare some time for her. She never complained and was satisfied just to see him. The only person in the Petacci family who knew about the relationship was Mama Giuseppina, and in the spring of 1934, she was also the first to learn that Mussolini had ended the affair. He had firmly advised Clara to finally marry her fiancé. The now 21-year-old woman obeyed. Since life without Il Duce seemed meaningless to her, she didn't care what happened to her. In June 1934, Clara and Lieutenant Riccardo Federici married and moved into a service apartment near the Orbitello airfield, north of Rome. Since Clara could not forget her feelings for Mussolini, the couple soon lived indifferently side by side. In this situation, Mama Giuseppina intervened. In February 1935, she had her daughter come to Rome and showed her a villa on Via Lazzaro Spallanzani. She had bought the house a week earlier and offered to set up a room for Clara. This way, if she couldn't stand living with her husband any longer, she could come to Rome for a few days. On the one hand, Clara was touched by her mother's concern, but on the other hand, it aroused her suspicion, as the new house was directly opposite Villa Torlonia, the Mussolini family's residence. Did the purchase of the house not exceed the family's financial means? Giuseppina soon managed to dispel her daughter's concerns, especially since Clara had never shown serious interest in money and practical matters. Thus, she did not worry about the cost of this property, which, due to its size, design, and luxurious location, clearly exceeded the Petacci family's capabilities. But Mama Giuseppina already had a fairly accurate idea of who would pay for the new villa. In April 1935, a week before Easter, Clara announced her first extended visit to her parents' new house. A day later, an older woman entered the Palazzo Venezia, gave her name, and requested to speak to Il Duce. After just a quarter of an hour, she was admitted to Mussolini's office. The conversation took place privately behind closed doors. What was discussed during this half hour is unknown, but it is certain that Mussolini ordered on the same day that Clara's husband, Lieutenant Federici, be appointed as the military attaché of the Italian government in Tokyo with immediate effect, and that this matter was to be handled without any objection. As agreed, Clara came to Rome for Easter. 3 days after the holiday, Federici called to inform her of his transfer. He had been ordered to leave immediately and did not even have time to come to Rome to say goodbye to his wife. Clara was surprised by the haste but asked no questions. She didn't care much where Federici was, and she was glad he didn't ask her to go to Tokyo with him. Instead, it was arranged that she would stay with her parents in Rome during his absence. From her room's window, Clara could see Villa Torlonia and the Mussolini family's park. She attentively followed how the pearly white Alfa Romeo convertible arrived punctually at 8 in the morning to pick up the Duce and brought him back home around 9 in the evening. During the day, the house and park seemed deserted and the car was not visible. Clara read in the newspaper that Mussolini was staying in Venice. Barely 3 weeks after her husband's departure, Clara's phone rang. Il Duce was back from the lagoon city. From her window, she could see the lit window of Villa Torlonia where he was calling from. He was alone. His wife was on the farm in Carpena with the children. The next morning, Mussolini planned to drive to Lido d'Ostia for a few days of royal R&R at Castel Porziano. He invited Clara to join him, and she packed faster than you can say adultery. The next day, she stood with her small suitcase at the intersection of Via Nomentana and Via Novara, where Mussolini's chauffeur whisked her away to Ostia. Thus, the affair between Mussolini and Clara Petacci was rekindled, thanks to the scheming efforts of Mama Giuseppina. Neither could resist the temptation. The reasons for the aging Mussolini were clear. He felt flattered by the admiration of the attractive young woman and desired her. He made it clear once again that she would always remain his lover and that he would never leave his wife and family. Clara's motivations were presumably more complex. Initially, she was attracted to the eroticism of power, but her relationship with her mother may have been decisive. As a very young girl, she had already idolized Mussolini and admired his strength and determination, qualities she missed in her father, who was completely dominated by her mother. Suffering from her mother's dominance herself, she had become an insecure child, and later an unassertive woman. At the Duce's side, however, she felt strong and finally recognized by her mother. In her hubris, she probably did not see that her mother was using her for her own purposes. After their cozy beachside rendezvous in Lido d'Ostia, Clara slipped back into the routine of visiting the Palazzo Venezia every afternoon, waiting in Mussolini's private apartment. They would sit together, and she would read him the newspaper. Often she played Chopin records, signaling to the private secretary Novara that the room was off-limits. However, Clara often waited in vain and eventually received a message to go home. Sometimes Clara didn't see Mussolini for days and had to be content watching him from her balcony in the park of Villa Torlonia, where he played tennis or rode his horse in the morning. When he looked up and acknowledged her, she was happy. If he ignored her, she moped in her darkened room for hours. When Mussolini traveled, Mama Giuseppina also packed her bags. Often the Petacci family's Lancia, driven by chauffeur Gasparini with mother and daughter in the back seat, trailed the Duce for days without ever catching a glimpse of him. Every day Clara didn't see him, she wrote to him, and once the letter was ready, she would let her mother read it before Gasparini delivered it to the Palazzo Venezia. In the long run, the affair couldn't stay under wraps. Too many people saw Clara entering the Palazzo Venezia daily, and Mussolini's closest associates couldn't ignore her presence in Mussolini's private apartment. Soon the rumors started circulating. The consequences for Clara are vividly described by the writer Franz Spunda in his book Clara Petacci, based on diary entries and authentic reports. One day, Clara arrived at the Palazzo Venezia as usual in the early afternoon, but was immediately sent home by Ercole Novara, who told her that Mussolini would have no time for her today. Aimlessly, Clara wandered the streets, unwilling to return to her parents' villa but unsure where to go. She found herself in front of the fashion salon where her mother usually shopped. Determined, she entered the elegant shop, gave her name, Signora Federici, and was ushered into a small salon. The manageress quickly called some of her best clients to inform them that the mentioned lady was in her shop. Clara took her time browsing, with a house mannequin showing several garments, and eventually tried on a few. When the choice was made, the manageress herself escorted Clara to the door. At that moment, the rear windows of several luxury limousines parked outside the salon rolled down, and the ladies inside scrutinized Mussolini's favorite. Realizing what was happening, Clara hurried away as if pursued by furies. In her flight, Clara ran into a crowd celebrating on its way to the Piazza Venezia. Unwillingly swept along, she eventually asked what was happening. People looked at her in disbelief. Haven't you heard? We have defeated Abyssinia. Il Duce will speak soon." On the piazza, Clara looked up at the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia amid the jubilant crowd. Finally, the tall double doors opened, and Mussolini stepped out, followed by his voice over the loudspeaker. Clara barely paid attention to his speech. She only saw the woman who had come to stand behind him on the balcony, Rachele Mussolini. With tears in her eyes, she walked back home. It was clear that Giuseppina Petacci expected advantages from her daughter's relationship with Mussolini, and Guido Buffarini, the Undersecretary of the Interior, also aimed to profit from the Duce's infatuation. Buffarini, always on the lookout for income sources, hoped to gain more influence over Mussolini through the Petacci family. This ambition would not be fulfilled. The Duce allowed himself to be influenced by no one, certainly not by a woman. But financially, Buffarini had bet on the right horse. The foundation of the ingenious scheme was a few pitiful letters Clara had received from poor Romans, which inspired a charity project to aid Rome's downtrodden, with Clara as the saintly patroness. Buffarini proposed to the Duce that they tap into a special fund he controlled, letting Clara play Florence Nightingale to the needy. Mussolini, always one for a good PR move, agreed, granting Clara free rein over the funds, provided she kept a ledger. But once the money started flowing, it mainly filled the pockets of Buffarini, the Petaccis, and, let's not forget, the token dribble to the poor. Stefano Persichetti, Clara's uncle, managed the creative bookkeeping, presenting the doctored records to Clara for her signature. She should have noticed the glaring discrepancy between the charitable outlays and the ministry's generous contributions, but Clara, content with her mother's approval, never dug deeper. In spring 1938, Mama Giuseppina, dreaming big, bought a 5,000 square meter plot on Via Camiluccia on Monte Mario for £500,000. With her trademark gusto, she launched the construction of a palatial villa. The project, devouring money faster than Mussolini could spout propaganda, stalled twice. Each time, Clara's brother, now flush with cash thanks to Buffarini's insider trading, came to the rescue. He and Buffarini were rolling in dough from their lucrative side hustle of gold and currency smuggling and government contracts. By November 1939, the Petacci family moved into the unfinished 32-room Villa Camiluccia, a sprawling glass and stone behemoth. Their old house was sold, so they had no choice but to move in. By now, Clara's affair with Mussolini was Rome's worst-kept secret, the hottest topic of every gossip circle. The only ones blissfully ignorant seemed to be her father and Rachele Mussolini. Undersecretary Buffarini, ever the schemer, suggested Clara divorce Riccardo in Hungary, where it was actually doable. Clara agreed, and Buffarini handled the paperwork. On August 7, 1941, she was set to leave for Budapest. That morning, she visited Mussolini at the Palazzo Venezia to bid farewell. Amidst the romantic strains of Chopin, the phone rang, breaking all protocol. The Duce received devastating news. His son Bruno, a bomber pilot in Pisa, had fatally crashed during training. Mussolini dropped everything and rushed to console Rachele, leaving Clara in the dust, waiting in the next room. Clara endured 7 lonely days in Budapest, ensconced in a luxurious hotel and indulging in retail therapy, but feeling isolated. One morning, feeling unwell, she saw a doctor. She penned in her diary, "The longing for you keeps growing, and I carry a secret. Can I hide it from you? Maybe it will be unpleasant for you. You already have so many worries. I certainly won't say a word. Do all women feel this way, not knowing how to bring it up? Perhaps it will help you forget the sorrow over Bruno if you hear that. Would you prefer it to be a boy or a girl?" Upon returning from Budapest, Clara was struck by severe abdominal cramps, dizziness and fainting. For 2 weeks, she remained confined to her room, admitting only Giuseppina. Finally, Signora Petacci confided in her husband, who diagnosed an ectopic pregnancy. A specialist confirmed this and urgently recommended surgery. To avoid scandal, Giuseppina insisted the operation be performed at Villa Camiluccia. After the procedure, Clara teetered between life and death for 2 weeks but eventually recovered. An examination revealed she could no longer have children. 5 weeks after her recovery, Clara ventured out to the Palazzo Venezia. The day before, she had received her divorce decree from her Hungarian lawyer. Meanwhile, Mussolini probably had a fresh batch of Chopin, ready for their next rendezvous. On June 10, 1940, Italy threw its hat into the ring by declaring war on England and France alongside Germany. In 1941, they expanded their enemies list to include the Soviet Union and the United States. The war, which the Duce had confidently proclaimed would last a mere 3 months, had already dragged into its second year, and the supply situation was going downhill faster than Mussolini's approval ratings. While Rachele Mussolini tightened the family belt, even forbidding the children from using the car to save tires and gasoline, Villa Camiluccia was the land where rationing went to die. Clara was courted by foreign ambassadors, diplomats and ministers, lavishly entertained by Mama Giuseppina, who seemed to think food rations were for peasants. Clara's wardrobe boasted the latest fashion creations, and when she fancied a stroll, she simply called her chauffeur. Gasoline rations? What gasoline rations? The Duce's already tarnished reputation suffered further as the war dragged on. Mussolini's exhortations to the Italian populace to endure sounded like a cruel joke in light of the Petacci family's ostentatious display of wealth. Yet the family of the maîtresse en titre continued to bask in the height of their power. Meanwhile, Rome faced the war's harsh realities as enemy bombers started making frequent appearances, sending residents scrambling. No bombs had dropped yet, thanks to the Vatican's proximity, but leaflets were scattered, stoking public sentiment against Mussolini. Whispers of corruption, conspiracies and decadent orgies at the homes of the elite spread like wildfire. The German Secret Service, always up for a good spy novel, reported to the Führer in April 1943 about Italy's war weariness, sabotage by government insiders, and a conspiracy against Mussolini by named party officials. The report concluded with a catchy phrase making the rounds: "The Petaccis cause more damage than 15 lost battles." The Petacci family's looming nightmare was the Duce's downfall. Mama Giuseppina took proactive measures, building shelters in the cellar of Villa Camiluccia and stockpiling supplies, especially food and gasoline. She also made sure to secure the valuable correspondence between Clara and Mussolini. On July 10, 1943, the Allies landed in Sicily. The next day, Mussolini received a hefty dossier from his state police titled Family Francesco Saverio Petacci, detailing all the suspicions and evidence gathered against Clara's family over the past 2 years. The dossier painted a picture of Donna Giuseppina's ambitious scheming, Clara's brother Dr. Marcello Petacci's shady dealings, the public outrage over Villa Camiluccia's splendor, and the parade of prominent visitors. Mussolini, upon reading it, erupted in a rage that echoed through the padded doors. 2 days later, Stefano Persichetti showed up at Villa Camiluccia, managing the money Clara received for her so-called social program. He reported a check for over 150,000 lira. Clara, ever disinterested in financial matters, found such conversations dreadfully boring. Money magically appeared. Where it came from was none of her concern. The next morning, Giuseppina handed Clara 10,000 lire with instructions to distribute the money at the refugee camp on Monte Testaccio. Clara reluctantly complied, as the refugees usually greeted her with distrust and rejection. Despite this, she saw herself as a queen doling out charity to her subjects. She dressed in her usual refined elegance and called chauffeur Gasparini. Neither mother nor daughter considered that their fashionable appearance might offend the impoverished refugees. The women at the camp, dressed in rags, viewed Clara with contempt. She felt uncomfortable among these unkempt and unfriendly women and was relieved to leave. She was oblivious to how much she hurt their pride. Probably it wasn't malice but thoughtlessness and indifference. Essentially, Clara cared as little about poverty as she did about wealth. The only thing that truly mattered was Mussolini and her relationship with him. While Clara played queen for a day at the refugee camp, a search took place at her uncle Stefano's house, and security officers confiscated the books recording her charitable works. The women of Monte Testaccio, fed up with Clara's arrogance and incompetence, returned the 10,000 lire she had given them. Although they needed the support, they refused to accept it from a woman who epitomized everything they despised. Their pride simply wouldn't allow it. So, as Mussolini's empire crumbled, Clara remained blissfully out of touch, gliding through her gilded life, unbothered by the realities that surrounded her, until the inevitable fall would drag her back down to earth. When Clara showed up at Palazzo Venezia for her regular afternoon visit, she was stopped by 2 guards. Novara, Mussolini's private secretary, informed her that the Duce never wanted to see her again. Her belongings were packed and ready for pickup. Clara, always with a flair for drama, assumed another woman had captured Mussolini's heart. Unbeknownst to her, the Duce was facing far bigger problems and was on the brink of being ousted. Desperate, she drove home and locked herself in her room. Meanwhile, the world turned upside down. The Allies landed in Sicily on July 10th, led by the flamboyant General Georgius Patton. By July 24th, the fascist Grand Council had enough and voted 19-7 against Mussolini, with even his son-in-law Galeazzo Ciano turning on him. The next day, Mussolini was summoned by King Victor Emmanuel III. Ignoring his wife's warnings, he went. The king dropped the bombshell. Mussolini was out, and Marshal Badoglio was in. The Duce was arrested and sent to a mountain hotel in the Gran Sasso Massif. Minister of Education Giuseppe Bottai later described Mussolini as somber, ashen, with sunken cheeks, worried and tired eyes, and a bitter expression, humiliated, sad, and unable to bear the burden of his 60 years. The Petacci family, not exactly thrilled with the idea of prison decor, fled to Lake Maggiore, but were arrested on August 12th and tossed into Novara prison. Clara's diary entries read like a soap opera. Friday, August 13th. Waking up this morning was terrible. We were afraid to look at each other. How are you, Ben? I don't know. I only know that they can take my life for yours if it helps you. Monday, August 16th. I will not see you anymore. But no one will banish you from my heart, never as long as I live. Even if I were no longer in your heart. Who can condemn me? Loving you has been my right until now. Now it will be my duty. Wednesday, August 18th. Mama still in bed. Terrible day, my bones broken on the iron of the field bed. This morning I felt you intensely, Ben, close by. I had an hour of sweet memories, an hour of sweet melancholy. I see you, feel you. You cannot end like this. We will find each other again. You will overcome, and I will always be your little, faithful, devoted companion. Or will they shoot you before the Germans free you? I know nothing. God alone knows everything. I only know that if saving you meant dying for me, then they can take my life instead of yours. If only you are saved, if only you can return to your high post, my Duce, my only love. On September 3rd, Prime Minister Pietro Badoglio signed an armistice, demanding Italy's unconditional surrender. The king fled Rome with his family, leaving chaos in his wake. On September 9th, German soldiers freed high-ranking fascist officials from Fort Boccea near Rome, including Guido Buffarini. On September 12th, German paratroopers staged a daring rescue of Mussolini from his mountain prison. That same day, a special German unit swooped in on Mussolini's estate in Carpena, where Donna Rachele and her children were held. They were flown to Munich, where the Duce arrived the next day. On September 17th, the Petaccis were freed from Novara prison. While Mussolini and Buffarini plotted with the Germans, Rachele helped the cook prepare macaroni in Munich. Meanwhile, the Petacci family was chauffeured in 2 large black limousines to Milan. Upon arrival, Clara heard Mussolini's voice over the radio, announcing he had taken over the government again. On September 23rd, Mussolini declared a new state, the Italian Social Republic, with Salo on Lake Garda as its capital. With German backing, he attempted to regain control over northern and central Italy. As the first snow fell on Monte Baldo, fascist politicians cozied up in villas around Lake Garda. For days, freight trains carried their furniture, wealth, documents, and archives to safety before the Allies could occupy Rome. The fascist party rebranded itself as the Republican Fascist Party. Mussolini, wishing for a quiet retreat, was forced by Hitler to remain the figurehead. His mental and physical decline was glaringly obvious, but Hitler insisted he stay in charge. In short, while Clara grappled with her melodramatic misunderstandings, the Duce's world was crumbling faster than a poorly made tiramisu. On October 10th, Mussolini made his grand entrance at Lake Garda, setting up shop at Villa Feltrinelli. His first order of business, courtesy of the Germans, was to deal with the traitors of July 24th. This put him in the awkward position of prosecuting his own son-in-law, Count Ciano. Daughter Edda's tears and pleas fell on deaf ears as Mussolini instructed the court to conduct the trial without regard to persons, whoever they may be. 19 men had voted against him, 13 fled to Spain, and 6 were tried in January 1944. 5 were sentenced to death, including Ciano. Edda had a full-blown nervous breakdown. Despite this familial melodrama, the Clara Mussolini romance wasn't dead. She lived in Milan, he was at Lake Garda. They occasionally met for romantic rendezvous in between. Clearly, Clara found these stolen moments insufficient and lobbied for a more permanent solution. Enter Mama Giuseppina and Guido Buffarini, now Minister of the Interior for the Republic of Salo. They orchestrated the Petacci family's move to Lake Garda, conveniently near Mussolini's Villa Feltrinelli. The brazenness echoed Signora Petacci's earlier stunt of buying a house directly opposite Villa Torlonia in Rome. Back then, Mussolini's wife was blissfully ignorant of the affair, but had since been enlightened and confronted Mussolini during their Munich stay. She noted in her diary, "It was a very calm exchange, which ended with the matter being considered as never happened." Rachele had bigger fish to fry. "We must be the first to make sacrifices," Mussolini had declared, decreeing his family could only buy food with ration cards. The Mussolinis likely were the only ones at Lake Garda observing this restriction, constantly hungry and scrimping on everything from food to soap. The first to notice the Petacci's presence was son Vittorio. Confronting his father, he got only a puzzled headshake. "With everything we are experiencing at this moment, there are really still people interested in this gossip?" Mussolini responded disapprovingly. A few days later, Vittorio received a 7-page letter from Clara, who had clearly been briefed by Mussolini. She chided Vittorio for his inability to rise above the banal, and for seeing her love for the Duce as a source of concern. She wrote, "I demand nothing from your father, and would give everything, even my life, for him. But he needs me, and in our few hours together, I can console him for many a bitterness. Without me, your father would be even more isolated." Clara seemed to forget that Mussolini, while enamored with her, had a family that mattered to him. When Rachele discovered the Petacci's presence, she wasn't about to accept Clara's proximity quietly. She stormed over to Villa Fiordaliso with Buffarini, where an SS officer admitted them. Clara descended the stairs, elegantly dressed as always. Rachele, in stark contrast, could no longer afford new clothes. Yet the Romagna woman wasn't intimidated by outward appearances. In a calm, cold voice, she delivered a scathing monologue on the sanctity of marriage, the extravagance of the Petacci family, and the value of the man who once ruled Italy. Clara remained silent until she reached for the phone to call Mussolini. Determined, Donna Rachele took the receiver. "We will speak at home," she declared, and hung up. Rachele seemed to have won. The Petacci family packed their bags and left, but Buffarini found Clara another secluded house. Mussolini and Clara continued their clandestine meetings with heightened security. As the new republic teetered, the Allies advanced, reaching Milan. On April 17th, Mussolini left Lake Garda for Milan, intending to negotiate surrender terms with the National Liberation Committee. On April 23rd, he called Rachele, instructing her to go to Monza with the children, promising to meet them there. The Petaccis also left on April 23rd with false Spanish passports and flight tickets arranged by Buffarini. Clara escorted her parents and sister to Milan's airport, but refused to board the plane, planning to stay with Mussolini. Clara's decision not to secure her safety, but to remain with Mussolini, earned her a posthumous reputation as a great, selfless lover, seen as proof of an elemental force between her and the Duce. In reality, her choice was driven by more complex motives. She needed Mussolini to escape her domineering mother. Staying behind also allowed her to finally defeat Rachele Mussolini, who had tormented her for years. By remaining, Clara saw a chance to claim Mussolini entirely for herself. When Clara visited Mussolini in Milan, he was surprised, but didn't insist she leave. He was glad not to be alone. On April 25th, the Republic of Salo surrendered unconditionally. That night, a convoy left the Milan prefecture. Trucks carrying black shirts and Republican ministers, followed by 2 trucks with SS officers and 2 more vehicles carrying Clara, her brother Marcello and his family. The convoy headed to Como. Mussolini's grand plan was crumbling faster than a cheap suit, but he couldn't resist the melodrama of a doomed romance. Clara's steadfast presence might have seemed romantic, but it was wrapped in layers of personal ambition and desperation. Meanwhile, Mussolini was caught between his familial duties and the allure of Clara's unwavering devotion. In the end, history would judge their love story as one part tragedy, one part farce. Upon arrival, Mussolini got the delightful news that a truck carrying the government's stash of money, gold and valuables had been nabbed by partisans. Ever the stoic, or maybe just too tired to care, he took this news in stride. His priority was now to gather the few loyal followers he had left. Former Minister of Culture Alessandro Pavolini had vowed to lead the last faithful fascists to Como, from where they would stage a dramatic last stand in the Alps. While Mussolini waited for Pavolini, he penned a farewell letter to Rachele, giving her meticulous instructions for fleeing to Switzerland. Apparently, even in defeat, Mussolini remained a control freak. In the early hours of April 27th, the Duce decided it was time to leave Como, as the National Liberation Committee's influence was spreading like a bad rumor. The convoy hit the road again, aiming for Menaggio and then the mountains near Grandola, just a stone's throw from the Swiss border, to await Pavolini. Mussolini and Clara checked into the Hotel Miravale and tuned into the radio to hear about the complete collapse of resistance, uprisings in northern Italy, and a decree promising death to fascist leaders. It was a classic case of bad news followed by worse news. One by one, Mussolini's remaining loyalists ghosted him. Even Guido Buffarini made a break for the Swiss border, but was promptly caught by the border police. Clara begged Mussolini to flee with her. She had already arranged a cozy hideout, the Jöckerhöfel farmhouse in South Tyrol, with the help of her SS babysitter Franz Spiegler. But Mussolini, ever the stubborn one, refused. He wanted to wait for Pavolini, who did show up that night, accompanied by a whopping 12 soldiers instead of the expected 3,000. It was the fascist equivalent of a no-show party. Desperate, Mussolini agreed to join a 200-strong German anti-aircraft unit heading to Innsbruck. The convoy rolled out again, with Birza leading, Mussolini in an Alfa Romeo, and Clara and her brother Marcello in a car flying a Spanish flag as the rear guard. The convoy was stopped by partisans from the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade, who allowed the Germans to pass but detained the Italians. Birza suggested Mussolini disguise himself as a German soldier. Mussolini complied, but when the vehicle started, Clara tried to hop on. Birza yanked her back. The convoy made it to Dongo, where partisans searched the vehicles and discovered Mussolini. Partisan Urbano Lazzaro described the capture. The man who made the world tremble, whom I had idolized as a young man and later cursed, sat there crouched at my feet, pale and almost lifeless. He held a machine gun between his knees, the stock under his chin. He stood up and waited with his head held high and lifeless, unseeing eyes. His face was waxy, and in his detached stare, I recognized no fear, only fatigue. Mussolini seemed robbed of all willpower, seemed mentally dead. Upon hearing of Mussolini's capture, Clara rushed to the partisan leader and persuaded him to take her to him. Meanwhile, the National Liberation Committee for Northern Italy had decided Mussolini's fate. Walter Audizio, a former anti-fascist Spanish fighter known as Colonel Valerio, was sent to Dongo to solve the issue once and for all. Mussolini and Clara were taken to a small farmhouse near Bonsanigo. Around 4 p.m. on April 28, 1945, Colonel Valerio burst into the bedroom, pretending to help Mussolini escape. He led them to a waiting car, clinging to the fender while 2 companions stood on the running boards. The car stopped in front of Villa Belmonte. Valerio ordered Mussolini and Clara out. As they stood on the street, Valerio aimed his machine gun. Mussolini remained calm and detached, while Clara screamed, "No, no, you mustn't do this. You mustn't." 1 shot later, Clara collapsed. Mussolini, in his final act of defiance, pulled open his jacket and demanded, "Shoot me in the chest." Those were his last words. The bodies were taken to Azzano and transferred into a furniture van already carrying 15 dead fascists. By the early morning of April 29, 1945, their mud-spattered corpses hung upside down from the iron canopy of a half-bombed-out gas station at Piazzale Loreto in Milan, the city where Mussolini had seized power 23 years earlier. The people had to know that the era of fascism was over, and nothing says game over like a dictator hanging out at a gas station. Even today, Clara Petacci is often hailed as the great lover who stayed loyal to Mussolini, allowing herself to be shot alongside him at the end. By glorifying her relationship with Mussolini, she managed to ignore the fact that she was just a disposable plaything for him, sacrificed by her family for their social ambitions. Her repeated declarations of wanting to die for Mussolini added to the myth of the great lover. "I want to die with him. My life means nothing if he is dead. I die anyway, but slower and with more suffering. I only want to die with him. You can't refuse me that." Meanwhile, how did Rachele Mussolini experience the last days of the fascist regime? In a letter dated April 27th, Mussolini wrote to Rachele, "Dear Rachele, I am now in the final phase of my life, on the last page of my book. We may never see each other again, and so I write to you and send you this letter. I ask your forgiveness for all the wrongs I unintentionally did to you, but you know that you were the only woman I truly loved. I swear this to you in this final hour by God and our Bruno. You know we must go to Valtellina. You must reach the Swiss border with the children. On the other side, you will start a new life. From heaven, Bruno will help us all. I kiss you and hug the children. Your Benito." After reading the letter, Rachele was overwhelmed with fear. On the phone, Mussolini repeated what he had written and urged her to take the children and flee to safety. "Hurry, all the best, Rachele, all the best." Then the call was cut off. On the verge of collapse, Rachele was forced into action by the sight of her children. They quickly got into a waiting car and headed for the Swiss border, only to be denied entry. She decided to drive to Como. Along the way, they encountered fleeing Italians and German soldiers, with partisan groups descending from the mountains and gunfire ringing out here and there. When Rachele and the children finally reached Como, Mussolini had already left. They were settled in a neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The radio was abuzz with calls to hunt down the enemies mercilessly. A young man identified as a fascist was executed right in front of the house. Then the radio announced the news of Mussolini's execution in Dongo. Later, Rachele wrote in her diary, "Justice has taken its course," said a voice on the radio, "and I can only think that no human ingratitude and no malice can harm Benito anymore. He gave Italy everything, even his life." The woman brought to his side at the last moment to amplify the scandal has atoned through her own sacrifice. Although this did not correspond to the truth, it was Rachele's explanation for why Clara was by Benito's side at his death. Desperate for survival, Donna Rachele reported to the Liberation Committee of Como. Her always apolitical stance likely saved her life. She was briefly separated from her children, and then the British interned the Mussolini family for 3 months in Terni. Afterward, Rachele and her children were sent to live on the island of Ischia. In Forlì, Rachele ran a cafe and fought for a pension and the private estate of the Mussolinis, Carpena. When she finally secured her beloved country residence, she returned to Romagna. Unlike her daughter Anna Maria, she stubbornly refused to collaborate with the neo-fascists in later years. Anna Maria died in 1968. Vittorio, who served in the Italian Air Force like his brother Bruno, emigrated to Argentina. Edda lived in Rome, and the youngest son, Romano, made a name for himself as a jazz pianist. In 1949, Rachele published her autobiography titled My Life with Benito. The proceeds from this book, focusing on personal memories and little on politics, contributed to the family's livelihood. Rachele fought fiercely for her husband's remains, which had been buried in a pauper's grave alongside Clara Petacci at Musocco Cemetery in Milan. For more than 10 years, Rachele and Edda campaigned for his transfer to Predappio, which was finally allowed in 1957. Donna Rachele, who epitomized the fascist ideal of the wife and mother with her traditional views on women's roles, stayed true to these beliefs until her death on October 30th, 1979, in Carpena di Forli at 89. In her memoirs, she wrote, "To you, Benito, my unforgettable companion, I dedicate these words. For 36 years I lived by your side and witnessed your arduous struggles, your cruel, hard work, and your burning willpower that watched over the fatherland like a living torch. In her stoic, traditional way, Rachele Mussolini kept the flame of their legacy burning, albeit in the modest, grounded way she had always lived her life. The story of these two women, caught in the whirlwind of Mussolini's tumultuous end, paints a vivid picture of loyalty, love, and the bitter ironies of power and downfall.